Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our series exploring the topics highlighted in the top 10 priorities for research on neurodivergence. We are thrilled to have you here today for what promises to be an insightful and impactful discussion. My name is Agata Ostaszewska, and I'm the Embracing Complexity lead. Embracing Complexity is a coalition of organizations working together to facilitate evidence-based inclusion of neurodivergent people. The purpose of the Embracing Complexity research is to identify barriers that lead to the social exclusion of neurodivergent people and effective ways of removing them. Just to give you a bit of context about our work and why we think it's important to examine the impacts of diagnostic categories on all aspects of neurodivergence and explore alternatives for research and services. Neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories, for example, ADHD, autism, developmental language disorder, dyslexia, and others, play a central role in shaping services design, research, and support systems for neurodivergent people. Receiving a neurodevelopmental diagnosis can bring about positive changes in the lives of neurodivergent people, which include supporting the development of personal and social identity, fostering self-acceptance and self-compassion, and often contributing to improved mental health. Therefore, the importance of the identification of neurodivergence can't be overstated. However, recent research by Duncan Astill and his team at the University of Cambridge suggests that current neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories may not accurately capture the daily experiences of neurodivergent people and are not well suited to effectively guide, support, or inform research. The researchers advocate for a transdiagnostic approach to neurodevelopmental diagnosis, services, and research as a viable alternative. For anyone who is interested in learning more about this research, we are sharing a link to this paper in the chat. So we support the shift from the rigid diagnostic labels towards an individualized needs-based framework. As Sue Fletcher-Watson argues, moving away from predefined diagnostic labels and adopting an approach centered on individual needs aligns more closely with the neurodiversity paradigm. And we're also sharing a paper to that, a link to that paper in the chat. Additionally, the deficit-based criteria of neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories are one of the contributing factors to stigma towards neurodivergent people. These various issues within the current diagnostic system and its implication on services, research, and the lives of neurodivergent people indicate an urgent need for researchers, research funders, policymakers, and other professionals to explore alternative approaches to research and to services. We carried out a priority setting for research on neurodivergence with an approach which included neurodivergent people with different diagnostic statuses. And we are also sharing a link if you would like to find out more about these priorities. We are also sharing a link in the chat. Why we carried out this priority setting and took this approach. So we hope that the identified research priorities, which don't focus on a specific diagnosis and cut across neurodivergence, will contribute to shifting approaches to neurodivergence research and ultimately lead to better outcomes for neurodivergent people. To our knowledge, this is the first research priority setting focused on neurodivergence, which moves beyond the boundaries of neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories and includes people with different diagnostic statuses. These priorities were developed over 3 stages: participatory research with the advisory group, which consisted of 6 neurodivergent people with different diagnostic statuses, a survey, and a workshop. So just about the webinars. We decided to organize a series of webinars to promote the priorities and the approach to research and services, which goes beyond the boundaries of neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories. Each webinar aims to explore research themes identified in the priority setting. Additionally, we will discuss the highlighted issues in the context of research approach, which moves beyond the boundaries of these categories. So we developed topics for webinars with a group of stakeholders. And throughout this series, it's going to be 3 webinars, and today is the first one. We aim to shed light on the significance of neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories on services, research, and most importantly, lives of neurodivergent people. Today's webinar, Deconstructing Diagnostic Categories, Shifting the Narrative on Neurodivergence, will explore how diagnostic categories often frame neurodivergence through a deficit-based medical model, and how can this lead to a pathologization and marginalization of neurodivergent people, and how it also have impacts on research, steering it towards areas like cure and genetics, rather than focusing on support and environmental adaptations that the community prioritizes. We will also examine the broader social and cultural contexts that are often overlooked in these frameworks. As part of our commitment to inclusivity, all discussion in this series will consider intersectionality, acknowledging that experience of neurodivergence are shaped by various factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, disability, and others. So we are very excited to have 3 speakers with us today. The first speaker is Lorraine Fontan. Lorraine is a peer researcher who leverages lived experience to provide insights on neurodiversity and inclusion. And Lorraine has a background in co-production and research coordination, and she helps shape inclusive practices and policies. The second speaker is Monique Botha. Monique is a community psychologist with a focus on autism, social psychology, equality, and mental health. They are passionate about producing research that can help autistic people of all ages to live equitably in communities. Their approach to research, training, and service design is nothing about us without us. Everything should be done from a participatory or a group-led approach, where the expertise of the community is appreciated and embraced. And research and services should aim to be interdisciplinary, rigorous, and accessible. And the third speaker is Helen Neale. Helen is a qualified psychotherapist and registered member of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. She has lived experience of neurodivergence, both personally and professionally, coming from a neurodivergent family and a parent to neurodivergent children. Helen is a freelance counselor with Mind in West Essex. She also works as a counselor with Head Staff ADHD therapy, and has a private practice in Essex. She also volunteers for a new charity set up to help and support neurodivergent people mental health, which is called NeuroBetter. So these experts bring a wealth of experience and knowledge from both research and lived experience, and I'm sure you will find their insights invaluable. So our first speaker is Lorraine. Lorraine has pre-recorded a video, which consists of slides with text and the audio recording. And the audio is a bit quiet, so please put your volume up.
Historically, autism has been viewed through the lens of a biomedical research model, reflecting the perception that autistic people and other forms of neurodivergence have something fundamentally missing or wrong with them. Early research primarily reflected the perspective of parents and caregivers of autistic children. This meant that professionals and caregivers dictated much of the research, leaving out the voices of those with lived neurodivergent experience. As a result, autism research developed a deficit-based focus, concentrating on identifying biological causes and developing interventions aimed at helping autistic children appear more neurotypical. Autism was viewed as a condition to be treated and even cured. An example of this deficit-based focus is the emphasis on eliminating behaviours and ways of being that were considered different from neurotypical norms. Clinicians would go to great lengths, sometimes using extreme methods, to eliminate these behaviours, such as prescribing powerful antipsychotic drugs or employing forms of corporal punishment, like slapping the child whenever they engaged in behaviours deemed disordered through a neurotypical lens. The pathologization of neurodivergent traits has meant that behaviours such as stimming were viewed as something to be fixed and eliminated, even when the behaviour was harmless and served an important purpose for the neurodivergent individual. Fortunately, there has been a significant shift over the last decade. Autistic and neurodivergent individuals have increasingly advocated for a role in the research that affects their lives. This growing involvement has led to a broader, more inclusive approach, with a distinct shift towards psychosocial-based research. Whilst the landscape of neurodivergent research has shifted, deficit-based neurodevelopmental diagnostic categories have remained largely unchanged and unchallenged. These categories continue to influence our views and perceptions of neurodivergent individuals and the research that impacts and shapes their lives. Deficit-based diagnostic categories can also limit access to diagnostic pathways and support, primarily for individuals who are more able to mask their neurodivergent traits. How often do we hear, yes, they might have ADHD, but they aren't bad enough to get diagnosed? The perception that a neurodivergent diagnosis should only be offered when an individual is already struggling leads to missed opportunities for early diagnosis and support. Neurodivergence does not exist in a vacuum. The lived experience of neurodivergent individuals is deeply intertwined with intersectional factors that shape how they are perceived, biases they face, and the level of access they have to resources and support. Recognizing these intersections is essential to understanding the full scope of neurodivergent experience and ensuring that research and support systems reflect this complexity. An example of intersectionality and systemic bias is seen amongst children from ethnic minorities who display ADHD traits. These children are often labelled naughty or disruptive rather than being recognised for their neurodivergent needs, a bias that leads many to go unrecognised and undiagnosed. As a result, they miss out on the support and resources essential for them to thrive. It is important to recognise that these biases can lead to false assumptions about neurodivergence. One such assumption is that an individual's position on the spectrum is fixed. If someone is identified as needing low or high support at diagnosis, the assumption is that this need will remain constant throughout their life. In reality, this view is too simplistic. Our position on the spectrum is not static. It is fluid, dynamic, and can change significantly over time. Neurodivergent traits can evolve, with some becoming more dominant than others at certain points in life in response to stressors or change, either positive or negative. An example of this fluidity is seen in autistic regression when some individuals experience a substantial loss of skills or abilities, which may require them to need much higher levels of support than before. Someone who previously lived independently may find themselves needing assistance with daily living tasks or navigating the external world. Equally, with neurodivergent affirming care and tailored therapies, individuals can also exceed prior expectations, developing skills and abilities that enhance their independence and quality of life. As autistic regression is under-recognised, I really quickly wanted to just share a slide detailing some of the factors that can influence an individual experiencing autistic regression. Deficit-based diagnostic categories focus on the label, not the individual. This overshadows a broad spectrum of neurodivergent experiences and restricts research scope. For instance, individuals with overlapping neurodivergent diagnosis, like autism and ADHD, or co-occurring mental health conditions, are often excluded from research studies. Perspectives from those who are nonverbal or considered having high support needs are also frequently excluded. Due to systemic biases, they are often deemed too challenging to include or labelled as vulnerable participants, with protective barriers preventing their participation in research. This exclusion limits understanding of how different neurodivergent traits interact and impacts the development of inclusive, effective support strategies. This slide just shares a few suggestions on developing more inclusive research. We know from studies that involving those with lived experience and neurodivergent individuals themselves actually results in research that's more holistic and more diverse. When we talk about autism and other forms of neurodiversity, it is essential that we recognise the diversity within each diagnostic category and understand that our position within it is dynamic and ever-evolving. Without new and more inclusive research, it is harder to challenge the deficit-based biases of past research. We must take proactive steps to ensure marginalised groups are meaningfully represented in research. This begins by reaching out directly to these communities to build genuine connections. By listening, asking questions, and working to remove barriers to participation, we can create a more inclusive and accurate research landscape. Shifting the landscape of research requires us to release preconceived notions about what neurodivergence is or should look like. It's about moving beyond the focus on deficits to ask, what's right with you, rather than just, what's wrong with you? This approach opens doors to strength-based research that honours neurodivergent identities, embracing them in all their humanity, complexity and diversity.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And our next speaker is Monique. And Monique, over to you.
Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm an autistic and ADHD researcher at Durham University. That's new, used to be at Stirling. But a lot of my work and practice really focuses on how we can secure better research for neurodivergent people and also better lives, and that'll come through. So to begin with, I want people to reflect on who is research for and what is research for. And those sound like really, really broad questions because kind of they are. Historically, research, if you had asked anyone at any point in time, they would tell you that the research is for the groups that it's meant to serve, right? So autism research is for autistic people, ADHD research is meant to be for ADHDers, the same with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, any of the developmental neurodivergence that we associate under the neurodiversity umbrella. But in reality, it's not really. In reality and in practice, research has predominantly been for the people who do it. It's a way to earn money. It's people's careers. It's my career, for example. In order to get promoted, you need to publish papers. You need to do research that's ranked highly. You need to get funding from funding bodies that predominantly fund biological and medical research. And even if you ask people, what the research is for, in research that we did with autism researchers, the majority will say improving quality of life. That underlies the goal. But when you start picking this apart, you realize quite quickly that we aren't talking about the same thing. So in this mixed methods research that we did, one of the things that we found is that everyone will talk about quality of life, but when you get into the nitty-gritty, it's something else entirely. The people who readily pathologize autistic people very openly aim for the eradication of autism and believe that the only way you can increase quality of life is to remove the barrier, and they perceive that barrier to be the neurodivergence in the first place. You compare this to people who are working towards acceptance, who, when they talk about quality of life, they talk about changing the world. They talk about changing attitudes, changing services, and changing the focus of research to approach, for example, autistic people holistically. Because at the moment, research is focusing and really trying desperately to find the unicorn. What does this mean? It means that when we think about neurodivergent traits and categories, we think about them as discrete. That means we don't tend to focus on the overlap. The amount of studies that will have, for example, participation criteria that says that you can only take part if you have no co-occurring conditions. But we know that the majority of, for example, autistic people also have another neurodevelopmental neurodivergence, or, for example, a mental health issue like depression, anxiety, or PTSD, right? which means that when we design research around only one cohort of people, and it's the unicorn, we're not actually getting accurate representations of basically anyone. Neurodivergent people is all recognized, and what I mean by this is if we only focus on those who are diagnosed, this assumes that all of the neurodivergent people out there who are neurodivergent have been recognized, and we know that this isn't true. We know that there are diagnostic disparities that predominantly affect women, gender minorities, people of color, and Black people, and people from lower socioeconomic statuses, right? Which creates this problem where essentially you're saying that unrecognized neurodivergence is unimportant. But again, we know this isn't true. So for example, regardless of whether you're diagnosed or undiagnosed, you are more likely as an autistic person to face victimization, including from family members, friends, romantic and sexual partners. And that's regardless of whether or not you have that diagnosis. But here's the important thing. Studies recently by Liz Pellicano and team also found that it was traits of ADHD that predicted polyvictimization in autistic people, which again shows you that if you're only focusing on one diagnostic category, you're not really capturing what might be important and underlying some of the victimization that neurodivergent people experience in the world. Which means that things like, and bear in mind in all of my studies that I've done for, years now, when we include self-diagnosed people, one of the things that we find is that, and we won't test for like any meaningful differences between people who have a diagnosis and people who don't across a range of measures. And the thing is, there's never any particular statistical differences. So for example, undiagnosed neurodivergent people tend to mask at the same rates. Undiagnosed neurodivergent people tend to experience the same rate of psychological distress, the same rates of minority stress, which means that unless you're actually capturing everything out there, we can't fix the biggest problems facing neurodivergent people, right? Because not everyone is going to have a diagnosis. And we can't expect them to, particularly because, for example, in North Lanarkshire, we won't even assess adults at the moment for ADHD. They've decided that the list is too long, so they're assessing no one, right? Which means that actually being able to capture some of these experiences is even more important in this contemporary context. The most important thing is that we enshrine suffering, right? Which means that if we only focus on neurodivergent people who are diagnosed, to get a diagnosis, you have to be in some way struggling. People keep saying, it's only people who are, struggling to this degree that will diagnose, but it reaffirms the idea that suffering is inherent to being neurodivergent, that only people who are really not doing well deserve to be recognized. But this keeps us in a cycle. It keeps us in a cycle where we only recognize suffering or neurodivergent people at rock bottom, which means we leave them till rock bottom to actually intervene. There's no primary care there, right? There's no preventative care. We don't stop them going into crisis because we'll only recognize them when they are in crisis. But it also means that we have no idea how to get other autistic people or neurodivergent people more broadly to a better place because we haven't even figured out what it looks like to do well when you are ADHD, autistic, dyspraxic, because we will only really address things at rock bottom. Really what this does is it's a failure to recognize neurodivergent people as whole. We would rather say that there were many autisms than recognize that there is a complex interaction between the environment, a person, their needs, and their other identities. So, for example, a recent study showed that it was less than 20% of intervention-based studies actually asked participants what their race or ethnicity was, right? So the majority of research out there has been done without even considering the complexity of people. We would rather, based on really poorly done studies from the 1980s, think of autistic people as either passers, failers, or hackers to theory of mind and split them based on those tasks, then actually address that outcomes are fluid, that people are fluid, that how we see people in one moment isn't actually the whole life. So, for example, when I was diagnosed with autism, I was told pretty open and shut that I was going nowhere, and I was probably the type of autistic person who was born to die, to suicide. Anyway, now people see me as an assistant professor at Durham University, and they're like, oh, well, you must have the easy kind of autism. And it doesn't really work like that. But until we embrace the fact that it's not a static trait, that autistic people, neurodivergent people with ADHD, and all of that neurodivergence into a bundle, that actually it is a complex interaction between traits, environment, time, and what we are actually afforded within our community. This represents a deep dehumanization and objectification of autistic people, because essentially, rather than assuming that autistic people vary because we're human, which is the truth, right? A lot of autistic people vary from one another because we have multiple identities. We come from different backgrounds. We have different experiences. We interact with the world in different ways. That doesn't mean that we're not all autistic. It doesn't mean that there are many autisms. It means that there are many people, right? And to assume that you can get everything down, and there is this push to, figure out what that homogenous autism is, but it's a human neurodivergence. There is no homogeneity because we're people and we're meant to vary in different ways from one another. And the reification of those stereotypes really limit recognition for multiple reasons. One, if you only see representations of autistic people at rock bottom, then before you are in crisis, you might not be able to recognize yourself in that. And sometimes it's a case of why would you want to? We ran a study this year looking at AI representations of autistic people through images, and all of the images were white. Like, oh my God. And the vast majority were boys. They all looked to be sad, hunched over, introverted, and suffering. And it is hard to recognize yourself in that if you are not white or not a boy or not suffering. But actually, I believe that neurodivergent people deserve preventative care and deserve preventative work, which means that reasonable adjustments are put in place so that we don't have to rebuild our lives from that crisis. These stereotypes also limit our ability to explain our experiences in society without being rejected. I mean, chances are almost every autistic person that you've talked to in the last, I don't know, probably 6 months has a story about, saying that they're autistic and someone saying, but you don't look autistic to me. And I feel like we should probably unpick that a bit more, because what does autism look like, if not people? But we really have created this self-sustaining stereotype that punishes people for being different. Apart from that, dehumanizing research permits the dehumanization of neurodivergent people. In one of our other studies, we took peer-reviewed autism research and created vignettes and then anonymized them. So took out any mentions of autism or autistic people, and then gave it to, alongside skills of dehumanization, to a bunch of people from the UK and US who weren't neurodivergent themselves. And we created a humanizing vignette and a dehumanizing vignette. So autism wasn't mentioned at all, but the descriptions of how we are described in autism research were, minus the word autism or autistic people or anything. And what we found was a distinct propensity to dehumanize based on that dehumanizing rhetoric, right? So part of the problem as well is that we are seen as authorities in research, and the more that we permit talking about autistic people or ADHD in non-human ways, the more we give that language to society to talk about us with, right? So The other thing about all of this being dehumanizing is that it really does lead to our dehumanization in society by people not involved in research. So yeah, until we recognize the full human spectrum and proper neurodiversity research, we're going to sustain this pattern. Actually shift the narrative, we need to take that transdiagnostic approach that recognizes that people are messy, that we take this holistic approach to identities, communities, and environment, that we are accepting and surpassing of the messiness of classifications, that we think about things as overarching traits that get treated a specific way in the world and by people, and how together with the environment that produces things like outcomes. It means recognizing when people are doing well and thriving, and that actually that is okay. It is okay for neurodivergent people to thrive. That doesn't mean that they're not neurodivergent. It means that they have figured something out, right? And until we actually address that, we will keep that going. We will keep those cycles of suffering as being inherent. And that really means shifting away from the firefighting that we see in services. And I understand that services are very, very limited. We live in a neoliberal society with austerity. I get that. But that also means stopping this practice. For example, there are multiple trusts that are writing to people who have gone to their GP to ask for assessment and saying, no, chances are you're not ADHD, you're not autistic, you're not dyspraxic, but we're not going to assess you properly. And that plants the seed of doubt in people's minds. And it also keeps people in a place where there is a good chance that they recognize themselves, but says that they're not deserving of support. And lastly, it means working together with neurodivergent people. That original research that I mentioned, one of the things that we found was that the closer you work with autistic people, the harder it is to dehumanize us. And that could go either way. It could be that people who humanize us are more likely to work with us, but it could also be that the more that you work with neurodivergent people, the harder it is to hold on to some of those really deficit-based understandings of us, right? So the future of research is actually just working hand in hand with neurodivergent communities equitably. And I believe it will produce better research because it will produce more humanizing research. Anyway, I'm aware that I've gone over on my time, so apologies, that's my bad. But thank you for listening, and I'm sorry if I talked really fast.
Thank you so much, Monique. That was great. And no, you didn't talk too fast at all. And our third speaker is Helen. Helen, over to you.
Hopefully everybody can see that. So thanks to both those presenters for some really interesting insights. I'm obviously going to be carrying on the same theme around shifting the narrative. I'm going to be chatting really about the importance and our mindfulness of language and the language that we use when working with neurodivergent people. This applies really to any situation. I'm a counsellor, but teachers, researchers, clinicians, support workers, and so on, because really language is power, and it really helps to shape our view of ourselves internally. So before I start, just a little background about me. My name's Helen Neale, obviously. I'm a member of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapists, and I specifically became a counsellor because of the experience I had as an undiagnosed neurodivergent person within the mental health system, both myself and actually for my brother, who is schizophrenic and also undiagnosed autistic and ADHD. I have a private practice seeing both children and adults, and I work as a freelancer with Mind in West Essex and Head Stuff ADHD therapy. As I've already said, I'm a late diagnosed neurodivergent person. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 50 years old, and I am a member of an extremely neurospicy family as well. My mum was an English teacher and a wannabe author. I'm a qualified librarian as well, so I've had a number of special interests throughout my life. And I think maybe that librarian and the English teacher from my mum has sort of created that interest in the psychological effect of language that I'll be talking about then. So I'll be covering three main areas. Initially, that importance of language, and then talking about that in terms of the labels associated with diagnosis, as well as the importance of choosing our words carefully when we talk about neurodiversity. And I think Monique touched on that around the sort of thresholds around diagnosis and suffering as well. Is it obviously important to put this into context psychologically around the use of language from childhood and into adulthood, and how that becomes critical in shaping an individual's view of the world. I'll then talk about what we can do to support neurodivergent people and how to change that narrative, specifically talking about neurodivergent practice, because I'm obviously a counsellor and operate with that neurodivergent affirming lens. And making sure that we're aware and supportive in all our interactions with service users and clients as much as we possibly can be. I do want to say that I've only got a short period of time to talk as well, and I really feel like I'm only scratching the surface of the effect that language that can actually have on us, and the support that we give neurodivergent people. But I'm hoping it will pique your interest to either reach out to me, Autistica, or perhaps even do your own research after the presentation as well. So first of all, I'd like to try something just very quickly. I want you to pop the first three words that come into mind when I click my mouse next. And I really want you to be honest with yourself as well, what those first three words are that come into your head when I next click my mouse. So I'm now sharing the word. It's actually an acronym. For those that cannot see the screen, it's ADHD. So can you just pop these things into chat so that we can actually see what those three words are? And I'll just give people a little bit of time to pop these things in, and then I'll go and have a look as well. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm getting so much. My ADHD is getting distracted. There's things like unpredictable, negative terminology, some strengths as well, creativity, intrusive thoughts. And that's just 4 letters. 4 letters that carry with it an awful lot of preconceptions and ideas. So you can see just from that little test what just one neurodivergent label brings. And can you imagine that for the individual concerned? There are so many different attitudes built from an individual's experience of that neurodivergence, their understanding of the language that's used within that label, like ADHD, for God's sake, how deficit can you get? As well as based on their own life experiences, the attitudes from media, and increasingly now, of course, social media as well. All of that brings that baggage. Preconceptions, which are often misconceptions about what neurodivergent people are like. So prejudices and biases, never mind the intersectionality that individual might have that Monique was talking about. And that brings with it the sort of thoughts around specific limitations, around empathy, perhaps, wishes for social connection, literacy, cognitive capacity, and also what Lauren touched on about a fixed feeling rather than the fluidity that we know exists for many neurodivergent individuals. It can be a bias around strengths too, and I've experienced this, such as creativity and detailed thinking for the autistic brain. I'm an ADHDer, and people might think that because of my autistic brain, I have an excellent attention to detail, and that may sometimes be the case. But actually, sometimes my ADHD part is in the driving seat and impulsivity takes over. And it's just like, hang the detail. I can't be asked with that. So in one individual, these presumptions can lead us to thinking we know what that individual wants and what they need. it isn't just something that happens within the neurotypical world either. It is possible, and I have again experienced this both professionally and personally, that neurodivergent over-identification can occur. So a neurodivergent individual might think, I can relate to that. I'm an ADHDer too, and I struggle to get started on tasks. So you must feel like that as well. So it's that idea of the whole and the peaks and troughs and the fluidity within that way of being. So the presumptions of how a neurodivergent brain works is something that we can all do, and the diagnostic labels can add to this with their lists of traits and tick boxes, which generalize even the atypical. Something called life scripts can also be influenced by these messages based on those prejudices and those biases around neurodivergence. Now, life scripts are part of what's termed the transactional analysis way of relating. We build an unconscious pathway throughout our life, which isn't really in the forefront of our mind. It's unconscious. And those life scripts can be formed through messaging from parents, carers, and so on. And obviously the ideas around labels and that deficit base can form part of that. We can subconsciously change to fit into these scripts, or maybe even observe things about ourselves and squash them into those scripts, because that's what we've been told unconsciously we are. It can be as simple as, oh, she's a little bit shy when we talk about our children, or any of those deficit-based sort of language ideas around neurodivergence. We might use those phrases a lot, and that means that our kids and ourselves, we take them on board throughout our lives. And if we think about those life scripts, is it any wonder that a deficit-based, non-affirming language and the labels and narrative that we're talking about could be potentially harmful for us as neurodivergent people? So this slide gives you a little bit more of an idea what I mean around life scripts, because those life scripts can result as in taking as what we call the OK Corral life positions. And it's a fun way to actually express quite an important and relevant concept here, I think. Our life positions fall in 4 different areas, and they help us to understand where we see ourselves within the world. It's part of, again, the transactional analysis theory, which is something that I use a lot within therapy, that was postulated in the 1960s by Eric Berne. And again, I'm really only touching the surface, and you can do a lot more research here, but you can see from this summary that life positions can be both positive, so an I'm okay life position, and negative, I'm not okay. And it says, I'm okay, you're okay. And that life position is, I feel okay. And if I'm relating to someone, I feel they're okay too. And you can see that we move through the 4 different life positions. As we develop our life scripts and take on the potential misconceptions around diagnostic labeling and that deficit-based narrative, we can actually find ourselves in that position of I'm not okay. Again, going back to what Monique was saying about you have to be in a particular place to be recognised and seen as neurodivergent within that pathologizing medical model. That can result in feelings of low self-worth and self-esteem, as well as people-pleasing and potentially imposter syndrome. And I've seen the I'm not okay, you're not okay, very personally, as my brother is in a mental health institution, and there's that sense of pointlessness and difficulties that have been built up around some of the labeling that they've experienced throughout their life. Using more neurodivergent affirming language moves away from these presumptions. And if we realize we have those presumptions and we can both acknowledge them and set them aside in order to use different language to help empower others to maybe both take those labels or move away from that, as we're talking about at the beginning, I'm not just talking about focusing on strengths here either, and just it's important to understand the reality for each individual, but being realistic about both strengths and impairments involved within neurodivergence. Personally, and as I said, I'm a neurodivergent person. Working through my own internalized ableism in therapy is one of the hardest things that I've ever done, and an ongoing process. My own preconceptions of my labels throughout my life have made it quite hard to move from that I'm not okay position. My internal struggles are obviously very personal, but that narrative around neurodivergent labels is not, and it's something that we have the power to change. And it is so unfortunate that this deficit-based language is written into diagnostic manuals. So with this in mind, what can we do? You've perhaps seen a little of the presumptions with looking at the chat when I mentioned ADHD. And maybe in the future we can all stop and actually take that whole perspective that Monique was talking about. So race, gender, neurodivergence, everything. And the first step is to realise that neurodivergent person's cognitive difference is part of them. It's part of the whole. It isn't something that comes with them, like a handbag or a pair of shoes. And that's why person-first language is so important. I am an autistic person, not a person with autism. However, when I speak about that, we do also have to be aware of that individual that we are talking to. And it might be that they wish to use different language. And it's perhaps not being afraid to explore that with any service user that we're working with. And it's something that exploring with clients can be really beneficial to help them to sort of get acceptance and understanding of themselves. The next step is to use a social model of disability rather than focusing on that medical model that we've talked about extensively today already. The social model obviously focuses on how environments can be disabling while still acknowledging the difference and impairments that disability can bring. So focusing on adaptations that can be made to support the neurodivergent people that we work with. And that medical model is, of course, much more focused on treatment and pathologizes the neurodivergent way of being. To give a little bit more detail about that medical and social model of disability and how that fits into the neurodiversity movement, the pathologizing language within the medical model suggests that there is a typical brain and a state of normal. However, when I ask that question within the counselling framework, no one ever really seems to understand what normal is. Often when we ask what we mean, we struggle to sort of articulate, because it's a set of principles imposed on us by society, a social construct, as we say here, and also potentially from those around us. We feel there is a normal, and we are pressured potentially from quite a young age to fit into it. Within the medical model, we are looking at neurodivergent people to fit into this concept and to comply, whereas within the neurodivergent movement, which embraces social model of disability, the aim is to collaborate with the individual and to work with them to provide autonomy, which promotes neurodivergent individuality rather than enforcing neurotypical norms. Diverging from the normal, she says in inverted commas, isn't a deficit within the neurodivergent community. It's a deviation from the typical and a natural part of human diversity. As Monique was talking about, neurodivergent people are people. And as such, within that neurodiversity movement, our aim is not to label individuals based on that external view of their experiences, but based on the collaborative way of working together to understand their internal experiences, their world, and how we might be able to support and reduce stress and challenge when it's required, but potentially to help them to understand themselves as well before the distress occurs. These supports are put in place in order to do that. rather than to focus on the reduction of symptoms and curative language and processes. For example, an individual might be open to medication to help and support them with executive function, or they may prefer to not take medication and have support and acceptance that they need additional environmental adjustments. It's about that autonomy and choice on what their view of functioning is and not what society's view is of that functioning. Again, another example, if an individual struggles to travel to a presentation for a face-to-face due to anxiety, then maybe we can offer adjustments. Presenters can share recordings, hopefully without the fear of shame or embarrassment or questioning from the conference provider. These can then be shown at that face-to-face conference, so we are more inclusive. This leads me on nicely to how we can be more neurodivergent affirming within our practices. Now, I don't want to bang on about this, but we really need to see the person and not the label. And that's done through a number of different things. Active listening, accepting them as they are, where they are now, and realizing, as we've talked about, and Lauren did so eloquently at the beginning, that these things can change. We presume competence and work with them to understand anything that they need. It's about exhibiting what counsellors would refer to as unconditional positive regard, where we have acceptance for a person as they are. And it's actually as simple as that. Sometimes this can be hard, particularly when we've have a service user that displays what, again, society considers to be unacceptable. So, for example, to give an example in an education environment, a child might greet you with a simple F off at the school gates every day. But let's look a little bit beyond what we feel is acceptable and what's actually happening internally for that child. I know that can be tough, and I really know that it can take patience as well. And sometimes we don't have a lot of time. We're all experiencing time poor, and I do acknowledge that. But taking that first step towards understanding acceptance can be really, really important. All of us as individuals have a unique lens through which we see the world. And I feel it's our job as practitioners to try and understand what that lens looks like now, and to find the supports for individuals to develop a positive identity through self-advocacy without feeling othered. We are aiming to walk alongside our clients, offering empathy, understanding, and acceptance rather than sympathy. In order to do this, here are some of the ways that we could start to change that narrative, and it can be small changes that can make a big difference. From considering the sensory needs of our service users to understanding that neurodivergent people are actually likely to have experienced trauma in their lives. This is going to affect both their way of being and any dialogue you have with them. That dialogue is, of course, a two-way street. So it's acknowledging that it's up to you as well as them to understand. And that's the double empathy problem that Damien Milton has so eloquently talked about in recent years. So that exchange and understanding works both ways, whether you're neurodivergent, neurotypical, or any combination thereof. Support difference goes beyond the sensory as well, of course, whether that's communication needs, pacing to help processing time, using declarative language, particularly with those that have potentially more demand avoidant traits such as PDAs. So, for example, from my own personal experience, I often don't say things like, why don't you eat an apple to my kids? I might just leave one subtly in the bedroom. Because that demand from society, parents and ourselves to eat healthily is still tough to navigate. And it helps to understand our kids' motivations, our own motivations, and using strategies and language that works for ourselves. And when I talk about our own motivations, something that always makes me smile about myself is that if I sign up for a swimming membership or a gym membership, I ain't never going to go. It's a demand. If I don't sign up, I don't feel I have to go. And actually, it's easier for me to go. I'm not saying I go all the time. frankly. You can probably tell that I don't actually. But I'm doing me here, and it changes for every single person that's sitting in front of you. So it means that sort of co-production type approach, and maybe gentle questioning around what people have done before in a situation. Every behavior is telling us something, so we can watch and observe and be open to new ideas and be creative and flexible wherever we can be. So for myself as a counsellor, offering sort of maybe shorter sessions potentially, and being a bit more flexible around boundaries within the counselling relationship. So we are looking really to create the environments where neurodivergent people can get the support they need without feeling like they're being a pain in the arse, with lived experience and understanding being at the heart of everything that we do. If we work in this collaborative way, neurodivergent labels can be overpowering, empowering, and they may potentially have their place. If we do decide, as we're talking today, to be more individualized and to have much more of a sort of individualized approach to the concept of neurodivergence, we do need to communicate that too, rather than just doing away with it. And I've heard anecdotal evidence recently within my own sphere of parents being told by local authorities that dyslexia no longer exists. It isn't that those difficulties no longer exist. It's that the label is being sort of removed. And it is that we're moving towards that more personalisation of understanding the neurodivergent way of being, with authorities trying to understand and labelling literacy difference, but they're needing to do that in a way that there is proper communication so that people don't think that that isn't something that happens anymore. So it's actually can be quite confusing if it's not managed sensibly and effectively from the get-go. So what really I'm trying to say here is that it's vital that the sense of co-production within that whole diagnostic narrative remains, so that when we work with neurodivergent people, that process is being done with us rather than to us. Small word, big difference. Thanks so much, and I really hope that you found that useful. And back over to Agatha now.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was amazing. So interesting. And I've seen in the chat that people have been having a lot of discussions. So I think, yeah, all of the presentations have gave us a lot of food for thought. I'm conscious that we are running slightly over time. And I know that we said previously that before that we will have a 5 minutes break. But is it okay with you, with the speakers, if we go straight into Q&A, because maybe some attendees will have to pop out. So if Helen and Lauren, if you could put your cameras on, if you are comfortable with it. And I'll just, there's been many questions, so I don't think we'll have time to go through all of them. But one question that has interested a lot of viewers was around the autistic regression. I think it was Lorraine who touched on that. And the viewers were asking if you can share more information about this, or are there any particular resources that you would recommend?
Everyone. I don't, unfortunately, have a specific resource I recommend. I noticed in the chat that a few people weren't sure about the terminology. It has been known previously as autistic fatigue, so maybe that's a term that some people are more familiar with. In terms of resources, from what I've seen anyway, I don't have a specific resource where I go, yep, that describes it well without it becoming pathologized or kind of feeding into these narratives that we talked about earlier. So unfortunately, I don't have a specific resource. But I could write a blog post if anyone wants specifics. What I would say, if anyone is kind of struggling with this or has gone, oh my God, that kind of reflects what I'm experiencing, is to take it seriously. It has been compared to a traumatic brain injury. It's not something that you kind of just want to sit on and just leave kind of to run amok. In terms of interventions and things we can do to help, it's really important to recognize that this isn't something that happens overnight, and that means that there's a lot we can do to prevent it. If you or someone you love or care for is in an environment that doesn't meet their needs, whether that's sensory, whether it's being in a school environment where they are constantly stressed out and not coping well, those can all be contributing factors to developing autistic regression. And it also comes off the back of autistic burnout. So it can be a result of autistic burnout that later down the line. But yeah, if anyone has any specific questions, just drop them in the chat.
Thank you, Lauren. And another question is, someone is asking, what are the possible ways for researchers to move away from the deficit-based approach to defining neurodevelopmental conditions or neurodevelopmental dimensions?
I'm happy to jump in if that's useful.
Yeah.
So I think one of the big things is move away from it yourself and push back. So whenever I review, and I'm now an editor for too many journals, but the one that I do the most work for is Autism and Adulthood. And every now and again, I'll get this paper that's like, really quite progressive, but they'll introduce autism as autism spectrum disorder and then list the APA, spiel from the DSM-5 about autism. Nothing that comes next in the paper leads me to believe that they believe it, but they don't. They tend to reproduce it because the response that we get during the peer review process is, well, that's what I usually need to put in to get it published. And even when we asked autism researchers in that mixed method study, a lot of autism researchers said that identity-first language was actually their preference, but professionally they use person with autism. So I think we need to get better at pushing back. So instead of framing it like that, frame it the way that a lot of us believe, which is that it's not just a list of deficits. Be more nuanced, and when you get pushed back, try to push back. Just because it's called ASD in the DSM-5 doesn't actually mean that every time you say it in a paper you need to say autism spectrum disorder. We all know what you're talking about when you say autism. And this is one of the things that I feel really passionately about, because at all parts of the process we are reinforcing the idea that it's a disorder. I think the other thing to do is do things more holistically. So one of the things researchers can do is ask your sample. Most autism research studies out there don't actually ask about co-occurring neurodivergence, and they don't ask about diagnosis, right? So either if they do ask about other neurodivergence, they'll specifically be like, are you diagnosed with something else? And the answer is a lot of people are going to come back and be like, no. But when you change small things in your wording, so one, when you ask your sample about other neurodivergence, you will have more of an idea about who your sample is, but also not just diagnosed. So for example, I've got an autism diagnosis. I don't actually have an ADHD diagnosis, because when I got the autism diagnosis, they were like, well, the ADHD is a bit of a backseat thing, isn't it? So we'll just label you with autism. Now that I'm an adult, my ADHD is, it is not a backseat thing. It is driving. And now I'm struggling to actually get properly assessed, even with all of my expertise. But spend longer than 5 minutes in a room with me, and it's pretty obvious that I'm also ADHD. So I think changing it to actually ask the right questions is probably a good starting point. And then also being more specific. If I see another study that just correlates, like the AQ20, with every phenomenon in that paper, I will lose my mind. One, because it's not unidimensional, it's measuring a bunch of dimensions, which means that people can have the same score and have completely different profiles. And two, because the non-specificity of it just means that you are throwing mud at a wall. If you are talking about a trait, be specific. What trait do you think is going to influence this phenomenon? And measure it properly, and then correlate it. Just using whatever measure of autism you've taken in your study and correlating it with like 50 other things in a matrix isn't science, and it isn't proper research. It's just leaning into that deficit-based model of thinking that all outcomes are the result of, this amorphous autism. So that's probably my beginning steps.
Thank you so much, Monique. There is also an interesting question about what services would be there for our neurodivergent children to help them to thrive and prevent burnout or crisis. And the person's added, I'm interested on your thoughts on what should our early interventions actually be doing instead of trying to reduce autistic traits. And I think that's for anyone who would like to answer.
I'll go first then. I think OT, so occupational therapy, is really underutilized for neurodivergent individuals. And it's actually, from what I've seen, both personally and professionally, a really useful tool, specifically for young individuals who can't actually verbalize or who may be not in a position to seek more like traditional forms of therapy, like talk therapy.
I think also to jump in and talk about counselling, because I've got a counselling hat on. That the prime concept within counselling is to accept your authentic self. And I think that having neurodivergent affirming counsellors working with children and letting them be themselves, whether that's a wonderful whirlwind in the counselling room, or whether that's someone that's more thoughtful, or whether that's someone that is non-speaking, or whatever, that being able to be with another human that just accepts you for you is incredibly healing and very powerful. And just playing, play therapy with younger children can be hugely beneficial. So using play as that form of counselling and developing that acceptance from a young age, and that's true of neurotypical children as well. It's a universal thing, the power of play.
I think I'm gonna jump in and add to that and take it from a slightly different angle, which is actually, I think one of the best things that can be done is family systems therapy, or intervening at a family level. There's a couple reasons that I say that. This AI study that we did, and the preprint's up, but I'll post it on my Twitter later, probably do a really depressing thread. Anyway, when we asked AI to imagine a family with an autistic kid, a really interesting thing happened, which was the families, a lot of them seemed a bit happier than the individual autistic representations, but they were a lot of them were hunched over a puzzle, doing a puzzle, right? Which, when you know the history between autism and the puzzle piece, is actually really dark, because it's this family, that revolves around autism, this family that revolves around that neurodivergent kid fixing them. And I think sometimes the way that intervention is done with families kind of reinforces that notion of this is the kid that's sticking out. Although I'm not saying that about anything anyone else has said today, by the way, just saying like, this is what can happen. In actuality, if you think of the double empathy problem, it's so complex, because autistic people, neurodivergent people may be born into families of similar others who help them both, get an appreciation for neurodiversity culture, inclusion, acceptance. but they might also be born into families with people who are undiagnosed and unrecognized, who have used masking to survive for like years, for their entire life, essentially. And what they can actually do is reinforce some of those messages about masking, including in the house. Ultimately, what you do get, including where there are neurotypical parents and autistic children, is a really complex manifestation of the double empathy problem, where people are struggling to understand each other, struggling to understand where they're coming from and those values, and actually intervening at a family level and saying, yeah, you guys, if you are different forms of neurodivergent, if you have different neurodivergent traits, if you're neurotypical versus neurodivergent, are probably going to have a hard time understanding each other, right? And it might result in increased conflict, but how can we actually help people to understand where everyone is coming from so that we're essentially addressing a dynamic and not a single individual in a family? And one of the things that this can do is create the affordance for authenticity in the family home and in the way that families operate. But it's something that's very, very, very rarely actually given to families, because when we get stuck in this idea of autism as an individual deficit, we don't tend to think about the wider like family system. So one of the things that I think is so vital is to think of everyone that's operating in that household and how they can essentially work together to make sure everyone's needs are met in that environment. Yeah. And the OTs absolutely always praise occupational therapists, especially neurodiversity affirming ones, because they'll actually work with kids to get them used to moving with their body, with their brain. And I think that that's really powerful, especially the ones that are more aware about like the intersections between different forms of neurodiversity or neurodivergence. If someone's working on a model of this is what I do with autistic kids, this is what I do with ADHD kids, it doesn't really work, right? But if you think about specific traits, it really can do something powerful. And then the last thing that I say is getting neurodivergent people connected with other neurodivergent people, including kids. And I'm not saying just stick everyone who's got like an ADHD diagnosis in a room and think that they'll get along swimmingly, but rather all of the messages that we get are so inherently negative that essentially the weight of the neurotypical expectation and the weight of stigma burns you out in and of itself. But actually providing positive representation, including in forms of connections, makes you reevaluate how you feel about your own neurodivergence. Because if you're connecting with people that you enjoy spending time with, that you like, that you can look at and be like, actually, they're really nice, they're really cool, they're also autistic or they're also ADHD, it provides an opportunity to reflect on yourself, reflect on the messages that you're getting about neurodivergence and say, well, that doesn't apply to them, so maybe it doesn't apply to me. So I'll always bang on about community connectedness, and this is no different. And it's not a formal intervention most of the time, and most of the time we don't want it to be a formal intervention. We want essentially those natural community bonds to be built from the ground up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for all the responses to the questions from the audience. I think we're unfortunately running a bit over time, so we might not have a time for more questions now, but if any of the speakers would like to answer more questions via email, you can pop your email in the chat. But thank you all so much for your presentations. They were really, really interesting. And I think that they sparked so many thoughts in the audience, and the chat function was constantly popping. So I think it's really great. And thank you so much. And we will upload the recordings from today to our YouTube channel, and we'll send the link to the recording to all the participants within a week. But yeah, thank you all so much for today, and have a great day.